The 58th year of Showa, early summer. It's June and the summer heat has arrived earlier than it does most years. By day there are crickets, and by night there are cicadas. We're in Hinamizawa, a small village in the countryside. There are fewer than 2,000 people here, but every year there is an event. This event is a mysterious death. On a certain day in June, someone dies, and someone else goes missing. The series of deaths is connected by the upheaval surrounding the dam construction project, a murder case that was covered up as being reenacted. Is it a conspiracy, a coincidence, or perhaps a curse? On September 8th, 2020, I uploaded the first of 199 episodes of my Higurashi playthrough. After many years of having the absolute wrong idea of Ryukishi 07's Higurashi When They Cry, I finally jumped into the series completely blind with the 07th mod. All I knew was that there was a huge mystery element, as well as potentially a horror experience, at least from the brief bits I saw of the anime many years ago. Again, I had the wrong idea. My impression of the series was that it was too scary for my puny heart to handle, so I continued to avoid it. I'm glad I eventually gave the series a try because while it does have some rare spooky moments, the main element is mystery. And goddamn does this series do a great job at preparing one confusing mystery story. A little over 2 years later, I finally finished Higurashi's 8 main chapters, which allowed me to see what was actually occurring in the small village of Hinamizawa. The deaths, the murders, psychotic events, and the seemingly unexplainable eventually all made sense. While there were many moments of absolute fiction, the story remained relatively grounded as it finally began to unravel in the final chapters. This video is my 200th Higurashi video, and I figured it would be best to look back on the predictions I made and some of the topics that I feel are best to discuss now that I have finished the main chapters. I am aware that there is more to Higurashi, such as other variations of the story as well as more to When They Cry overall, but this video is only looking at the 8 main chapters. I haven't proceeded to any other Higurashi titles or any other corners of When They Cry, but I have watched the first half of the original Higurashi anime adaptation, and I don't have much to say on that right now. Anyways, let's jump back into the world of Higurashi and start off with what I predicted through the first 6 chapters, and of course, if you haven't gone through Higurashi's main story, I recommend not watching this video. Alright, let's dive back in. Chapter 1 is the spookiest of all chapters, and there was a bunch of information flying around to the point where some things just went over my head. It also wasn't until way later into this chapter that the information began to come our way, along with the 5th year straight of Oyashiro-sama's curse. I at least predicted that the next chapter would involve Mion and some background on Watanagashi, and both of those are technically correct. Chapters 2 and 5 had Keiichi and Shion going into the forbidden storage house at the Furude Shrine, and information was given to us a lot earlier in chapter 2 compared to the first one, allowing me to think about everything this story has to offer a lot easier. I had to think in the back of my mind going forward, restricted only to Keiichi's perspective, 3 main things. Was it the work of man, the work of some fictional being, and what could be magically occurring? Chapter 1 made it seem like everyone was against Keiichi, but with the possibility of some weird, unexplainable stuff going on, such as the power of Oyashiro-sama. I surprisingly hit the nail on the head here with my predictions after witnessing the hard-to-explain ending of Chapter 2. Before knowing about the Mion-Shion switch, the possibility of a corpse walking around and there being a tussle between the two of them were ridiculous to think of there at the end. But I guessed 2 things correctly. Keiichi jumps to conclusions easily and becomes his own enemy in Chapter 1, which is technically true in a way, and Keiichi lost his mind at the end of Chapter 2, leading to him thinking he was being killed by someone who was already dead. The curse, or rather the syndrome in this village, played major parts in these chapters, and I wasn't even aware of it at that time. Keiichi's distrust in Chapter 1 was due to him reaching a level 5 and being a huge risk to everyone around him, including himself. He and others were also highly affected by it, which is why we saw something unexplainable from Keiichi's twisted perspective yet again. The only thing I predicted totally wrong was thinking earlier on that Shion and Mion were just Mion playing a big ol' prank. and I totally fell for it because right after I declared my prediction, I was immediately proven incorrect. Chapter 3 brought on the most amount of confusion among readers, and despite me saying that it seemed almost impossible for everything to connect and have proper reasoning, we eventually learned what all actually happened. Was there another Keiichi? Was there another personality of Keiichi? Was the curse of Oyashiro-sama latching onto Keiichi, since we've now seen him go a bit wacko 3 times now? Did Keiichi actually kill the right person or anyone at all? The big takeaway here was that I was sure that Keiichi's perspective alone was not good enough to see the entire picture. The reality of him being left in the dark and jumping to conclusions is what led to unnecessary confusion towards readers this time around. Chapter 3 also brought along one of the biggest blatant hints as to who the real antagonist is in the main chapters. While I was off being told by multiple people that Oyashiro-sama is real and that the Sonozaki family could be committing the murders, or at least choosing who will die, I didn't consider the possibility of another third-party group having a role. Near the end of this chapter, I thought there could have been a more serious cultist-like group, but not one outside the village. But it does make sense to be absolutely suspicious of Takano after showing up, Tomotake's bike in her car, no sign of Tomotage, Takano having fantastic body-burying knowledge, and wanting to keep this meeting a secret. I should have declared her as the enemy right then and there, especially since she always showed up around Watanagashi to put bad thoughts and ideas in Keiichi's head. While I didn't know of the syndrome yet, this was absolutely making things worse for Keiichi, leading to a more chaotic perspective for the remainder of the chapter. There are 4 things I predicted after the short but informational 4th chapter. First off, I successfully predicted that the deaths we witness are done by other humans. A shot in the dark, but it makes sense to predict this. Second off, I continued to believe that there was some sort of unexplainable magic happening as well, whether it was the curse or something else. I tied this in with the fact that every one of the first 3 chapters are different worlds, not the same world with different events based on choices, despite myself being adamant that it had to have been one world. I also predicted one of the central themes: fate. Things were happening in a pattern because of how fate was twisted to be by our main antagonist in every chapter, which I predicted as a strict path that we must follow. The third prediction was less of a prediction and more of a continuation of a Chapter 3 talking point. Keiichi's perspective is not reliable, and that he showed symptoms of psychopathy. And while he wasn't ever a psychopath in the series, nor was anyone else, I should have thought about these same chaotic and evil symptoms being a shared trait amongst our characters. That would have successfully led me into the direction of the syndrome, but I probably would have thrown it under a curse deal. The final prediction was a shot in the dark, but it was a really good one. Following the idea that a lot of what was happening is human orchestrated, what if there was a third-party group? I decided to forget about the whole cultist group idea and wondered if there was some completely unrelated group that was doing something here practically undetected. Our lovely gardeners in the white van were the only ones that stood out, and I seem to haven't considered them much since Chapter 1. I was close, but at least on the right track going into Chapter 5. Before jumping into my final predictions after going through Chapter 5, I stated my thoughts on having sympathy for how Shion went about her actions here. Looking back, I find it interesting that my statement on this was practically how Chapter 7 goes about things. I stated I couldn't sympathize with jumping to kill someone as a solution, and that there has to be another way. Sound familiar, right? In terms of predictions for what's to come, I'm continuing to believe that an outside group is to blame for the chaos in Hinamizawa, but I confused myself with the drug that Rika had in this chapter with what was used on Tomotage. Rika absolutely knows something we don't, which is a correct prediction, but needles popping up before led me to an incorrect judgment of Rika's intentions, which were luckily cleared up in the next chapter, along with clearing up any doubts of there being another Rika. The end of Chapter 6 gave me the opportunity to spill the beans on what I thought could be going on, and I still couldn't really say what was happening. I predicted that Takano was the antagonist, which was correct, but my prediction that she was also retaining her memories across different worlds was incorrect. She just liked to fuck with all the characters as a way of entertainment before the demise of the village. I also correctly predicted, through suspicion, of Dr. Irie having some sort of involvement in what was happening. I knew he wasn't being completely truthful and that he had something going on, especially since he appeared dead in 2 chapters where Rika was sacrificed. I also stood my ground on there being a third party at work who goes down the same route after getting rid of Rika, unless Shion gets rid of her first. Before going into Chapter 7, I stated my final predictions, in which I do believe there's a disease of some sort going around that leads to the delusions and irrational mental states of the main characters. I also predicted that the third-party antagonist group was the reason why everyone was killed, and not because of a volcanic gas, which would explain why Keiichi lived at the end of Chapter 3. And speaking of the 3rd chapter, I was able to connect some dots in regards to the wacky events that occurred. Similarly to the events that took place in Chapter 6, the main cast covered for the one who committed murder, and Mion went even further to hide the body in a better location. But because of the irrational states the murderers had in these 2 chapters, they couldn't really understand what was going on or trust their friends' statements. It led Keiichi into further confusion, and Rena down a path of more hatred. And that's the bulk of what I predicted at the end of every chapter. How far off was I? While I might not be the most clever person to jump into the world of Higurashi, I think I did an okay job with how I thought about specific things. Being able to determine early on that the deaths we've heard about in the previous years were most likely caused by other people was a huge first step in determining who the enemies ended up being. Chapters 7 and 8 spilled the beans on a lot of things, some that I probably could have predicted and others not so much. Chapter 6 allowed me to pretty much solve what happened to Keiichi in chapters 1 and 3, and a bit in the 2nd chapter as well. Chapter 5 helped me understand what happened in the 2nd chapter, and I began to open my eyes to the similarities of certain symptoms that Shion and Keiichi had. I quickly threw away the possibility of multiple personality disorder, as well as there being another copy of certain characters, which helped me see what happened in Chapter 3 a lot clearer, and solidified my suspicion of Takano as the main antagonist. I will also say that I was lucky to have you all commenting along with the playthrough as it came out to give me the hints I needed. I overlooked a lot, and I forgot a lot of key points over the 2 years it took me to finally wrap this up, but luckily you guys kept me in line and assisted me, and I luckily never got spoiled by my own comments sections, so you guys really did great in helping me out and making the playthrough feel more alive. To those who watched along with the episodes as they released and commented, I am absolutely thankful for your involvement in the playthrough. So that's all I had for the predictions throughout the course of the first 6 chapters or so, and now I would like to briefly talk about certain things that stood out to me throughout this long journey, including some topics that were suggested to me. There are a couple things to note though. First off, a lot about what I will talk about here are interpretations and opinions, which means they might not correctly align with what was originally intended by Rikishi07, and secondly, if I made a mistake or forgot something important with one of these topics, let me know. This video is to serve as a discussion with you guys after such a long playthrough. So, let's discuss. It's hard to rank these chapters, as there are highs and lows with each one, and each chapter serves a different purpose in order to unravel the mystery. However, I will admit that I think highly of chapters 1 and 5, so much so to say that the first chapter is brilliant. As I stated in the beginning of this video, I had the wrong idea about Higurashi, thinking that it was a lot scarier than it actually is. Chapter 1 didn't really change my mind on that, but instead it made me appreciate the atmospheric terror that resides in this one. Unlike all the other chapters where things begin to slowly make sense, except for the 3rd chapter initially, this one throws you into a story where it seems like everyone is out to get you and you don't know why. We hear about all these previous incidents from characters we are meeting for the first time after hours of slice of life fun, learning that there's a dark side to the village. Everything quickly changes after Watanagashi, where we now have someone that has died and another that has gone missing. We have stories of the past thrown at us to freak us out and confuse us, and it worked wonders on Keiichi. There's no way that the reader could tell that the perspective of the main character was twisted after all of this was thrown at us. Then we get one of my favorite moments in the series, Rena's— Oh, Jesus Christ, okay. Yeah, I gotcha. Okay, that was very loud. Everyone becomes our enemy. We as the reader find it hard to trust anyone in this village of strangers, and it seems like our own friends are out to get us. There is no time to stop and think about the spooky gazes that we get from Rena and Mion, Rena spying on us, Rena and Mion trying to kill us with a sharp object in Keiichi's food, or even Rena trying to break into his house. It's just horrible scenes one after another, making me think about what will happen next rather than what is actually happening. Chapter 6 made me realize I could have slowed down to think about what is actually happening, but I didn't. I fell for the brilliance of Chapter 1, and that is maintaining the spooky vibe during the storytelling along with keeping the reader confused. If I went back and read the first chapter from the beginning, it would be like jumping into a secret Chapter 1.5. Everything would make sense, and I would feel so gullible for falling for all the traps Ryukishi 07 prepared in this one. I stated at the end of Chapter 1 that I missed the slice of life moments because everything becomes scary and deadly, but it didn't have to be that way at all, and now we know how all of that could have been avoided. What an incredible entry to the series. One of my patrons, Dapper, suggested this topic to me along with a few others, but this is one that I had to cover. I've predicted in the earlier chapters that there is some sort of force that keeps Keiichi on some sort of path. This became evident in Chapter 3, where things appeared to be falling apart due to Keiichi seemingly committing actions that strayed from this path, and he was punished for it. While that wasn't exactly the case, we were definitely being introduced to the fate of Hinamizawa and its residents. In Chapter 7, we were introduced to the 3 rules that made up the fate of this story in the form of the letters X, Y, and Z. Rule X states that there is always a member of the friend group that will go crazy, leading them to distrusting those around them and committing terrible actions, such as murder. Rule Y states that Toмотake and Takano are always killed on the 5th year of Oyashiro-sama's curse, with the exception of Chapter 1, though she does disappear. So she either dies or disappears. Still the same thing. Rule Z states that there is a convincing force that leads people to believe that the Sonozakis are behind the yearly deaths and disappearances, which involves Ueshi and Takano to spread that around to those around the village and Keiichi. The funny part about this rule is that the convincing force doing this to the Sonozaki family is the Sonozaki family. As we entered the answer arc, we saw that fate can be changed if we bypass these rules. Rule Y was the most obvious reoccurring one, but before dealing with that one, rules X and Z needed to be bypassed. Killing off Z will prevent X from going into motion, since the syndrome comes up out of fear and distrust with the main characters. It's fascinating how these 3 rules existed from the beginning, and only one was totally clear, and that was the hardest one to tear down. But it all makes sense how these 3 rules existed based on what was happening during each chapter, as well as what has happened. It could also lead to a bunch of different possibilities in other worlds. What if Ueshi is the one who succumbs to Rule X since he's always raving about the Sonozakis thanks to Rule Z? Disaster is sure to come about to the main characters in this case. However, Rule Y is the most fated one to occur regardless of who falls to Rule X or to who believes that the Sonozakis are behind the curse in Rule Z. This is another topic that Dapper suggested I talk about, and I'm going to start this one off being pretty blunt. I can't relate to Satoshi at all. We learn that he is absolutely drained from having to continuously stand up for Sotoko because she isn't being even remotely cooperative, leading to an unhealthy relationship between her and the Hojo parents, and eventually her and her aunt and uncle. I can understand him being stressed out from the constant bullshit, but I can't relate to him having to constantly defend someone and eventually losing his mind as a result. His position was hard to understand and to get a grasp on, which is why I originally doubted Shion's claims in Chapter 5 that his mental health was actually his sister's fault. Besides that though, I do have to say that his presence in the series is very unique. He becomes an important character way before he's physically introduced to us in Chapter 5 based on the rumors around him. He transferred away? He was cursed by Oyashiro-sama? He ran away to get away from his family? He was killed by the Sonozakis? There were so many unknowns as to what really happened to Satoshi, with the solid answer not coming until the final chapter, and yet he played a pretty important role in the story. Sotoko lived on under the impression that her sweet brother would come home to her, though she did show her moments of weakness when that reality would begin to hit. Keiichi relied on the ghost of Satoshi in chapters 1 and 3 to accomplish some insane goals, such as defending himself against the village and killing the Hojo uncle. Shion also relied on the ghost of Satoshi in chapter 5 to keep herself sane, but let's be real, she was far gone at that point. The presence that she felt was obviously a symptom of the syndrome and not Satoshi tagging along like a party member in this lovely RPG adventure. While chapters 5 and 8 allowed us to get to know about Satoshi properly, all the other chapters created an image of Satoshi that wasn't quite right. Many believe that he was killed off by Oyashiro-sama or the Sonozakis, thanks to Rule Z, and that his presence was all that was left of him. We as humans work in mysterious ways and like to think things are occurring in ways that benefit us best. Shion thought the one she loved was still with him in spirit, and that kept her somewhat happy, albeit still crazy. Keiichi thought he had the okay to use his bat as a murderous weapon to right the wrongs that Satoshi had to face. And, of course, the most understandable is that Sadako felt that one day he would come home. This topic was a suggestion of one of my viewers, Matt Kerridge. The story, like many, is obviously fictional, but I find it fun to consider what events that we face could happen in reality or are entirely in the realm of fiction. During my predictions, I was trying to decipher what events were man-made and what were from some sort of magical forces. After going through the 8 chapters, there's obviously quite a lot of supernatural shit that occurs, even leading to how we got the happy ending that we fought through many chapters for. I'll only be addressing a few, so we're not here all day. Rika's power to jump worlds with Hanyu was something I found surprising the more hints we got throughout the story. Hanyu's obviously supernatural existence aside, Rika is regularly pulling a Steins Gate throughout the 8 chapters, retaining most of her memories when she world leaps from dying in her previous world. This can arguably make her the main character of the story, as the goal becomes to try to find a world that she and her friends can finally live peacefully in. It does clear up the confusion in each chapter having different events, unlike that of a normal visual novel where choices dictate the direction of the story in a playthrough, and it adds more stakes to the goal of finding that happy ending for everyone. There is the Furide background that could explain her having this power since she's supposed to be the reincarnation of a Yashiro-sama, but either way, I don't mind her having this ability and find it to be a cool twist that I couldn't have initially predicted. Okay, back onto Hanyu. I also don't really mind her role in the story. She's technically always been around, but we don't physically get to see her until chapter 7. There is a big hint of her existence in chapter 5 when Rika is fighting Shion, but other than that, she plays her role of the silent observer really well up until chapter 8. The final chapter allows her to finally put her newly found conviction into action and becomes a regular character, but she is still a god, and that's another thing. We have a god walking around, and with this newly found conviction comes the weight she can pull. When Rika offers to sacrifice herself to free Shion and Kasai from being killed, Hanyu had to step in as a god in order to make sure that they held their end of the deal. It kind of feels like cheating in a way, but again, I don't really mind her role all too much, with /god mode being activated here and there. And speaking of cheating in /god mode, why the fuck can our lovely cast of characters seemingly stop time and have a friendly chat? In chapter 1, Keiichi was getting run off the road by the mountain dogs, and he went into a freeze frame moment where he described how he was adjusting to the oncoming danger. I can let this one slide since Keiichi was undoubtedly going crazy with the syndrome, but then there's the end of chapter 7. Keiichi was shot at and everything froze before the bullet hit him. This allowed the cast of characters to realize that Keiichi will die, and accept that that was going to happen. And of course, there was the chapter 8 bullet near the end. Was this whole freezing deal ever explained? Or is this like the life flashing before my eyes phenomenon in some weird Hinamizawa way? Well, either way, I'm not a fan of this. While Keiichi's death did get more of a deep conversation going from it in chapter 7, it's all just unexplained. If there was an explanation for it, then I'd probably accept it. If it was a weird power of a Yashiro-sama or some shit, then yeah, I'd probably accept it. Maybe it was explained and I missed it? Oh well, it just bothers me, obviously. Another thing that kind of bugs me is the power that everyone has to change fate as long as they believe hard enough. You can argue that it's a bit of a cheap answer to the many problems the village faces, but I can also accept it. Fate is an interesting concept since it may or may not exist in reality. So the idea in reality is to have the conviction and strong beliefs for what you believe is right. People protest because they want change and have the conviction to fight for that change. People try hard at the gym because they want to grow and better themselves, along with looking like an absolute Chad. People don't want to just sit by and let the world go on, which is why I said that this fate-changing deal only kinda bugs me. I'm somewhat okay with it since fighting for something is a real concept in reality. I just don't like it when it's an absolute perfect way to win, which coincides with the Hanyu discussion. Maybe the village is blessed by Oyashiro-sama or Hanyu, and all you gotta do to live successfully is to have a strong will and believe in justice or something like that. And I did discuss the rules that made up the fate of Hinamizawa earlier, and I like that overall concept. It was cool and satisfying to see everyone beating the XYZ rules through some absolute hard work, but that's not to say that their strong beliefs in changing fate weren't at play either. But funnily enough, those rules weren't destroyed by conviction alone. A lot of things came together for the story to make sense, for our characters to drop their plans, and for the appropriate actions to take place. So I guess I have to ask you all, which do you think changed the fate of our characters in the village? Working together? Or believing hard enough? Or maybe both were even enough here. The more I talk about this, the more unsure I am about how I feel about this. The final pure fictional bit I'd like to bring up is the idea of fragments. I'll be honest and admit that the whole concept became confusing past the collection of important events in order to solve the mysteries of the story. However, I do like the Steins Gate idea of fragments carrying over to our cast of characters so that they can avoid making the mistakes they made in previous worlds. Chapters 6 and 7 were interesting worlds because of this occurring with the characters, leading to them solving their internal problems before they became world-ending external problems. However, it does get confusing when it goes past all of this, like with Akasaka getting a fragment from a future in another world, or Rika straight up allowing Takano to live peacefully with her parents. Time travel is always a difficult concept to implement into a story, as it can be done in so many ways, but it's hard to do it correctly. Higurashi's way around this is to just implement new worlds for when Rika dies, but then the fragments come along and make things confusing for me. Maybe I'm overthinking them. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on this, along with the other supernatural, pure fictional stuff that has come up in the story. Alright, let's get into some of my opinions here. Chapters 3 and 7 are absolute wild rides, but the problem that persists in both chapters has made me greatly dislike Sotoko. I was initially excited to learn about Sotoko in the beginning of the 3rd chapter, as up to that point she was just the annoying bratty character that clashed with Keiichi. She began to show a more understanding side when she helped Keiichi cook and began to talk about her lost brother. That was all well and good before shit hit the fan with her uncle showing up. The fact that Rika knew how dreadful it was for him to show up in a world should explain how much it sucks to have to deal with this whole problem. Solving the problem legitimately in Chapter 7 was a great feat, despite it seemingly taking forever to finally get to the end. But man, Chapter 3 really began to show me how difficult it is to like her character. I've talked about it numerous times, and I've read the comments as well, and I totally get that she is a character with a lot going on, including the syndrome making things worse. But in the end, I just could not enjoy her character anymore, and just accepted that she existed with her issues. She won the race against Shion as my least favorite character, which is funny because I used to think highly of Shion when she was introduced. It's weird that I can somewhat rank the main cast of characters, but not the chapters. But as some of you may have been able to guess, Rena is my favorite character. I was definitely afraid of her in Chapter 1, but Chapter 2 redeemed my interest in her. Despite the absolute insanity that shows in Chapter 6, and in past events before Keiichi showed up, she always came back on top as someone I can appreciate. I don't think I can relate to her problems by any means, except maybe that feeling of loneliness when there's changes in your living environment and all that, but she's someone I can sympathize with. Maybe not during her moments of committing murder in Chapter 6, since I don't think those murderous moments in Chapters 3, 5, and 6 can be sympathized with necessarily, but seeing her fall and make a comeback, along with caring for her friends in the end, is what was winning her for me. There might be some bias since she's always been that one character I saw as the cover character for the series before I actually jumped into the first chapter, but I gotta confidently say that she beats out Rika as my favorite character in the end. Plus, if there's no romance to come out of her and Keiichi, at least I can confidently believe that they're close friends in any successful world. The answer arc moved from the characters discussing the story to Ryukushi07 addressing us about the chapter that we just finished. He brought up the actions that Shion and Rena committed in chapters 5 and 6 respectively, and now that I finished all the chapters, well, my opinion is more or less the same, but I do have a better insight on reasonings for everyone. Many of our characters felt trapped, Keiichi thinking that the village was out to get him, Shion left in the dark about what was going on around her, Satoshi succumbing to his stress, Rena having to deal with someone entering her family, Sotoko left waiting for her brother to return, Mion having to become the new head of the Sonozakis, and Rika literally trapped in this deadly cycle. Many saw their way out of their entrapment involving committing a murder. We all thought that Satoshi not only committed murder, but also ran away to further his escapism. As I said about Rena, I can't sympathize with these murderous acts since there were surely different ways to solve the problems they immediately faced. Yeah, you can argue that Rena's life was at risk and her actions were probably a bit more understandable, but we saw through chapters 7 and 8 that all of their entrapped situations were handled properly, minus Satoshi, but now we know why he and others jumped to murder. But in general, syndrome aside, this form of getting away from their problems is not one I can side with, no matter what. There's a lot more I would like to talk about because there's obviously a lot that happened in these 8 chapters, but to end off these discussions, I would like to talk about what disappointed me the more I thought about it. Back in the brief talk about fragments, I talked about how our cast of characters gained their confidence in fixing their problems and developing themselves from events that occurred in previous worlds. These previous worlds were the chapters that we just went through, which makes it feel that everything we just read through allowed for proper character development even so the worlds are different. In chapter 7, we slowly see Rika gain the confidence that she needs to defeat fate with her friends, which is her character developing in this chapter. So what is disappointing here is that after such a perfect world that displays all of our characters learning from their mistakes and growing, we leave it for chapter's 8 world, which leaves Rika missing her memories of the ending events of chapter 7. It's hard to say if Rena's problems are okay and that Shion didn't struggle like she did in chapter 5, but seeing that loss of progress is what disappointed me. It's strange because the confidence that Rika spent the bulk of chapter 7 regaining after all of her failed attempts seemed to just transition over to Hanyu. And I'm glad that Hanyu had the conviction that she needed to join the fray, but it just came off as odd. Again, I don't mind Hanyu's character or anything like that, and seeing her development after her negativity in chapter 7 was great, but it would have been nice if Rika carried the momentum that she had in chapter 7 into the final chapter. It probably wouldn't have changed much except the pacing once we got into the actual story part of the final chapter, but at least I wouldn't be feeling like we lost a lot of progress in our main character's development in this story. And there we have it, predictions that I came up through the chapters of the series along with 8 discussion topics. Did I plan on there being 8? Nope. I just kept on typing away on Google Docs hoping that this video wouldn't end up too long. Higurashi When They Cry will undoubtedly stick with me for many years to come, just like many great stories have been able to from other mediums. I am excited in exploring the sequel and spin-off content that Higurashi has to offer, and I'll continue to decide whether I should look into the otherworldly works of When They Cry or not. I hope these topics are worth discussing in the comments or in my Discord or in a reply video. Remember those. But I do have one more thing to ask you all. What did you think of Higurashi? I would say that the series is far from perfect, but it's still really great and full of clever storytelling to keep the mystery going until the very end. One day I'll return to the series for a read-through of my own, looking out for the hints that were thrown all around the earlier chapters. It'll be a great replay experience. Thank you to all of you who joined me on this wonderful journey through Higurashi When They Cry. 200 videos is a lot of content for one series, and trust me, I would know from my Grisaya ventures, but it was a blast to experience this story for the first time with you guys, and I hope that my playthrough will lead many to checking out the series for themselves, or as a way of gathering more reactions for certain parts of the story. Before closing this video off, I would like to reiterate that the plan now is to jump into Higurashi When They Cry Re, which includes the Saikuroshi, Hirokawashi, and Batsukoishi stories. I had to pause each time to read off all of those. I don't know what I expected of myself in this script. But other than that, I await anything else that is Higurashi related to make its way over to my greasy hands. Thank you for watching this video, and thank you to my big supporters of Jamie11577, Overcodex, and Repoggers, along with all other supporters for supporting me on Patreon and through YouTube's membership deal. Thank you to those that stuck around for so long, and I hope you'll continue to stick with me. And also a big thank you to Full Metal for helping make sure that my script doesn't sound too terrible. I try my hardest with these projects, even so I don't do them too often. But alright, that is it for this one. Thank you again for tuning in, and I will see you in another video. Take it easy.